Good morning, all. Just a few comments here this morning. Obviously, we've got another round of visitors to the Capitol today, and that's good. That's what's great about America. Get a chance to express our positions. I know that what did we yesterday have about 13,000, maybe more like that amount or larger today. The bottom line is that's a fraction of the 300 or so thousand state and local government employees we have, the good professionals who work at the state and local level. And obviously that's a much smaller fraction of the 5.5 million people who live and work here in the state of Wisconsin, both in and out of government. And certainly we appreciate the fact that the folks here today are going to have their voices heard. We also want to make sure the taxpayers of the state of Wisconsin have their chance to have their voice heard. And so we're going to talk a little bit about where we're at, where we're headed over the next couple of days. First off, I want to talk a little bit. Yesterday, I spent a good chunk of my day starting out early in the morning and making my way after voting in Wauwatosa, making my way around to essentially all the different corners of the state of Wisconsin. And as part of that, I went to manufacturing plants, mainly mid and small-sized employers in this state, and talked about what we're doing with jobs and talked about specifically what we're doing with this budget repair bill as we prepare for the next biennial budget. And I got to tell you, almost to a person, at these companies, including at least one company that also has union membership involved with it, people viewed what we're proposing as being modest. Employer-wise, the manufacturers we visited, employees were paying, in many cases, anywhere from 25% to 50% of their health care premiums. When I was at my last stop in La Crosse and we had a similar type of group protesting outside, I pointed out then that what we're asking for in terms of state and local government to make in terms of health care contribution is half of what the guys at plants like that were making, and much less even than some of the other plants we visit along the way. In addition, when you look at the pension contribution we're requesting, the 5.8%, again, most workers outside of government view that as being pretty generous. At a number of the plants we visited yesterday, most of them had 401ks, and many of them had suspended the employee contribution from the employer, the employer contribution from the companies themselves over the last year or so because of the tough economic times that we're in, as a means of trying to protect as many jobs as possible. So outside of government, for the past year, year and a half to 2 years, employers have been doing this already. This is not something unusual. This is something that, again, middle-class workers in this state have experienced, and the bottom line is we're asking, really in many ways, not only nothing less, but in many cases, or nothing more, I should say, but in many cases much less than what many people, many middle-class working citizens in the state are already paying to keep and preserve jobs at their companies outside of government. A couple other things that were interesting. One of the stops yesterday I made, I always take time to say hi to each of the employees that took the time out to listen to us. One of them came up to me, a gentleman, and said, you know, my wife works for the state government. So, of course, I kind of expected, okay, here it comes. I was ready to get an earful. And he said, you know, she just started working a couple years back, and we were overwhelmed as to how generous our employee benefits were. In fact, she said at the time, it's only a matter of time before they wake up and have to realize they have to adjust this in order to keep the government going. So instead of being upset with us in our proposal, she said, or he said, that the two of them supported us. They thought it was the right thing to do. It was the right way to move this state forward. And we heard a lot of that. Obviously, there's plenty of voices who are being heard, and were heard in one of the longest committee hearings I can remember of, at least in the time I served in the legislature. And again, that's all fine. That's part of democracy, and we're willing to listen to folks and their concerns. But the bottom line is the taxpayers of the state need to be heard as well. The last thing we want to do to balance this next budget, which has a $3.6 billion deficit in it, is balance on the backs of middle-class taxpayers with higher taxes that would drive people and jobs out of the state of Wisconsin. That's why we're pushing with a much better alternative. And we certainly don't want to lay off people at a time. We don't need any layoffs, be it in the public or the private sector. We don't want to make the kind of choices that they're being forced to make in places like New York and California and other states where they're cutting billions of dollars from state aids to local governments, school districts, and the university system in those respective states. For us, this is a much better alternative as we head into the two-year budget proposal we're going to put out on the table next Tuesday. A couple other quick things, and then I'll take some questions. People ask, well, what's the impact on this on workers? One of the things I cannot stress enough, because I think it's something that even many of the people outside don't fully recognize, and that is the civil service system in Wisconsin was in place long before collective bargaining. It will remain fully intact long after this measure is passed. The protections that workers have, be they in a union or not, that are derived from the civil service system continue. They include merit hiring. They include just cause for discipline and termination. Those things do not change. I found more than a large number of employees I've talked to who somehow think that comes from their collective bargaining agreement. Those provisions may be codified in their collective bargaining agreements, but they don't exist because of that. They exist because in the last turn of the century, Wisconsin passed the strongest civil service protections in the country. Those are not removed. And in fact, if anything, one of the things we've talked about with lawmakers in the last day or so after some of the comments they've heard is other ways to further make that clear that applies at both the state and the local level. Those are the sorts of things we're willing to discuss because, again, we don't want to alter the civil service system. We want to protect workers. I believe along the way, the biggest changes workers will see into the future later this year as this is fully enacted is that, like all of us, myself included, my cabinet, the legislature, and others, will all be paying slightly more for pension, although, again, what most people are paying on national average. We'll all be paying a little bit more when it comes to health care, although, again, about half of what the premium contribution is on the national average. And union members, specifically workers who were previously part of a union, will find that in the end they don't have to have their union dues automatically deducted from their payroll. And for many of those employees, that means $500, $600 or more potentially that they can use to offset those higher health care and pension costs. So all in all, they've got all of that. They have civil service protection. There'll be no furloughs. The Doyle furloughs end in this budget. In the Walker budget for the years to come, there will be no furloughs in the future, which was the equivalent under Governor Doyle's budget of about a 3% reduction in pay. And there won't be massive layoffs of state and local workers to balance our budget. And the final thing I just want to point out, we'll give you a copy of this for those who want, but the other thing I keep hearing about is this is some great surprise. Well, again, I've been talking about this all throughout the campaign. In fact, one of the unions actually sent this is one of the many flyers that went out to union members all across the state, suggesting that they should not vote for me in the election. In fact, they pulled out some quotes from the media. One was from my website, where it said, you've got to free up local government officials to not be strangled by things like mediation and arbitration. Another quote was from the Journal Sentinel, where it says, Walker says he intends to void parts of labor contracts. Another quote from the paper was also from our campaign saying, we'd like to take the choice out of the collective bargaining process. All these were flyers that were sent before the November 2nd election. That's because I've been talking about this all throughout the campaign. I've been talking about it before, talking about it since. I've been talking in the same context about the fact that I believe we've got good, decent, hardworking people who work in government. But I also recognize to balance the budget, there's got to be some fairness, and we've got to be in balance with where the taxpayers are who foot the bill for all of us in government. And that's something that's been clearly relevant throughout this campaign, throughout the several months of the transition, and certainly in about the 6 weeks I've been in office. So with that, I'll entertain any questions if you got them.
Are you talking about extending state civil service protections for state workers to workers that are in municipalities or schools?
Well, we're looking at talking to lawmakers about ways to ensure that there are legitimate protections for government employees. We think, as we mentioned, we've got a good system, the strongest in the country for state workers, to the extent that we can make sure that there are legitimate protections for workers in the public sector at the local level. Those are all things we're going to be talking to lawmakers about. But
Excuse me for interrupting you, Governor.
well, again, those are just points that were raised. We haven't worked out any particular details on that yet. But again, those are concerns that people have expressed. Again, we want to make it legitimate that this is about balancing the budget and giving local governments the tools to balance the budgets, as long as it doesn't affect the fiscal impact, which goes beyond just the pension and the health care. It certainly addresses why we put a cap tied to the CPI on wages, and why there are some other factors that have a fiscal impact on local governments that we want to give them the tools for. But in terms of protecting civil service type protections, we want to make sure that those are in place.
Do you guys have that change to pass this bill, Governor?
No.
Do you
you not have to have?
No, I think right now, Senator Ellis said yesterday there are the votes to pass the bill in both the state Senate and state Assembly. I think that's confident. I think along the way, though, because this is part of the deliberative process, we want to make sure that we're listening to concerns that folks have raised at the hearings, that folks have raised to us and to lawmakers, and make sure that we've got a good, strong bill to go forward. But
could you give us some insight into tweaks that could be made in terms of amendments? I mean, you met with the Speaker this morning. Did you guys talk about that? What changes?
yeah, we had talked. My staff followed well into the middle of the morning, 3 o'clock this morning, the deliberations in terms of the public hearing in the Joint Finance Committee. We've been talking to finance members as well as to the Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader. And, that's a list that, we're certainly continuing to look at. It wasn't like we met this morning to have some final say on it. Rather, we're willing to work with them on it. If folks have followed in the special session, a number of bills that passed through the special session, our jobs plan, we worked with the legislature and made some tweaks on. Again, we're willing and able to do that. We're just not going to fundamentally undermine the principle of what we're proposing, which is to allow not only the state but local governments to balance their budgets.
Governor, can you talk about how the protests and some of the demonstration that's happened compares to your expectations for what you expected when you brought this bill forward?
I knew there'd be intensity. The other day they predicted 20,000. There were 13,000. I mean, to me, numbers are people. Everybody's got a right to have a say and have their voices heard, and that's fine. But as you know, Mick, I was a county executive in a county that never elected a Republican before. I was elected 3 times, I think largely because I told the truth. I spoke boldly about what I was going to do to identify problems, identified solutions, and then I acted on them. That's what we're doing here. For us, we expected that obviously there are going to be certain groups who are going to be more pumped up than others, but everybody's got a right to be heard, but it also means you have a right to be heard even if you're not taking off time to come here. And if you're at work, at your own job in the public sector, if you're at work, or if you're in the private sector at work somewhere around the state of Wisconsin, you have a right to be heard just as much as the people who are standing outside the Capitol right now. And we're going to listen to all the taxpayers in the state. I think it's unfortunate. I think it's disappointing. And I appreciate all the other public employees in the state who today and every day in the days to come will continue to show up and do their job that they're paid to do. And I appreciate them for doing that.
Being criticized for the budget announcement being in a private location, any response to that it's not at the Capitol?
No, for us, I mean, the document will be presented itself to the members of the state legislature. For us, we're honing in on the fact this drives a clear message that what we're doing is about getting the state working again. It's about helping the employers of this state refocus and find a way to put more people to work. And it's about getting the state government working again so that we don't pass deficits on from one generation to the next. But for us, I think it's incredibly important. And yeah, it's different. It's unconventional, but I think people have seen the last 6 weeks. This administration is going to be unconventional because we have to be. We're at a point of crisis. We've got an economic and fiscal crisis in the state, and we need leaders who are going to stand up and look at things differently than what we've done in the past.
That you're here in the Capitol building today as all of this is going on, are you taking any extra steps for yourself in terms of your movements or your security?
Well, we did this yesterday. I had protesters at most of the stops I made around the state. What I do is just try to not get in the middle of it, mainly because I don't want to provoke things. People have been relatively civil up until now. I anticipate that will continue, but why do you want to provoke anything? For us, again, people have a right to be heard. We're willing to listen. The closest we got yesterday was in La Crosse, where a bunch of protesters came out and surrounded the car for a second or two and pounded on it a little bit and put some vehicles in the way. But again, as long as people aren't breaking the law and causing major disruption, we respect that. But again, I would hope, just as I mentioned, we've got people who work in state and local government who are professionals, who are true public servants, who want to do a good job. And those who are here certainly have a right to be heard, but we're going to make sure that we're not intimidating to thinking that they're the only voices out there. There are plenty of other government employees who might have a slightly different opinion, and there are obviously about 5.5 million taxpayers across the state who aren't here who need to be heard as well. Thanks very much.
Will you interact with any of the people outside? Any other questions you guys have here?